Today's May
17.
17th, 2022, and I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce your last name.
Kurzenknabe.
Kurzenknabe, okay. With us today is Glenn Kurzenknabe, who's retired from the crystal industry, and if I understand correctly, your family was several generations ago in Harrisburg in the music business. And
Printing business.
Printing business.
First music, then printing.
Okay,
Yes.
and you were raised in Cumberland County?
In Camp Hill, yes.
Okay, and went to school at Cumberland Valley?
That's correct.
Okay, and then you graduated, you went to the Electronics Institute?
Yes.
And from there went to,
Greenray Industries.
okay, and progressed through the electronics. How did you get interested, or how did you end up in the electronics industry?
Well, I was always interested in electronics as a little kid, with electric trains and motors, and I discovered amateur radio, and I procrastinated and talked about it more than I did anything about it, but finally was licensed in 10th grade at Cumberland Valley, myself and another guy, Ed Cox, who lives in Florida now, and we got our licenses, and we were both crazy about electronics. That's the only thing that was on our mind. And I knew that at some point in my life I wanted to work in the industry, but I didn't know exactly what, although the broadcast industry is what really fascinated me, because I knew other ham radio operators that were working in the industry, and I thought that's what I want to do. Well, that didn't end up that way.
Okay. Who were the ham operators that were in the local radio industry? Do you recall any of them by name, or?
Well, I was acquainted with Ray Green
Okay.
when I was in high school, who I ultimately worked for. Herman Shaw I had met and was reasonably acquainted with. There were other people that were employee-type people that names escape me, but Gil Houck was an old-time employee at Mccoy. There were other hams that I just can't think of offhand, but I knew a lot of people that worked in the industry.
Okay. And was there an amateur radio club that got you in contact with those people, or how did you?
Well, there was a Harrisburg Radio Amateur Club, which still exists today, and I remember going to, right after I was licensed, I remember going to a club meeting, and when I was 15 years old, some stupid kid coming to a meeting, and there were people there, of course, from all backgrounds and education, and they all welcomed me as a new ham. And I remember that, and that first meeting, Ray Green was a member, and Ray Green talked about transistors, and I thought to myself, wow, this guy must really be smart. And of course, fast forward some years, and I was going to work for him, but little did I know at that point.
Now, this would have been in the 1960s?
This was in 1962.
Okay, so transistors were relatively...
They were new, yes,
Okay.
right.
And so did you work with vacuum tubes as part of your early? Or?
In my early experimenting and playing in ham radio was vacuum tubes, yes.
Okay. And...
Oh, and I also had a teacher at Cumberland Valley, Dave Anwell, who taught chemistry and physics, also had a loosely knit electronics group. He referred to them as his electronics misfits, and he was a big force in my life. In fact, sometimes I think he had more impact on me than my parents did. Sadly, he left teaching and became an airline pilot, and even more sadly, died of cancer. But man was just a wonderful man, and a big influence on my life, and others in the area too who worked in the industry.
Okay. So after high school then, was the Electronic Institute local?
Yes, it was in Harrisburg, and it taught a 16-month program on communications technology. Most people were going to work in the left that school that would go to work in the two-way radio business or in the broadcast industry or something related. As I said, I was thought I was going to work in the broadcast industry, but as I learned more and more about it, I decided that I didn't want to work from midnight to 8 o'clock in the morning when I was 20 or 21 years old. I had more important things I wanted to be doing, and so I never pursued the broadcast industry, although I knew a lot of people in that industry and still do.
Okay. So how did you end up at Greenray then?
Well, I had known of Ray Green. Of course, when I was in high school, I'd been to his house a few times, and of course, as a kid, scrounging parts and for projects. And I knew that he had a new company in Mechanicsburg, and I thought, well, it's time to start looking for a job. And I put my Sunday best on and went knocking on the door, and he remembered me and hired me as an entry-level technician. And so I started working, and I remember one of the first, he was on East Simpson Road in Mechanicsburg, and about 25 employees. And I remember one of the things was it sat me down in front of this bench with all this really nice test equipment, and I thought to myself that I'm going to get paid to play with this test equipment, and this was really exciting. And so I started working for him and progressed along in his company. Lots of twists and turns and fate, but that's how I got into the industry.
What would an electronics technician do at that point?
Well, my job at that point was every individual product had to be aligned, set up, tested, and ensured that it met the customer specification. So I was doing that as an entry-level technician and writing test reports that went with the product, and then I progressed into the engineering department and did it at a little bit more sophisticated level, and then eventually started doing some engineering work.
What were the products that they made?
Well, we built crystal oscillators, which used the crystal product, but then built the electronics around it to make a functional product out of it, because a crystal by itself really doesn't do anything. It has to have the electronics to go with it. And that's what we provided then. And of course, it went to all sorts of applications. And you have to remember too, that was the heyday and the beginning of the aerospace industry and the space program. And so we built product that went everywhere.
Okay. Top secret classified material?
At that time, Greenray did not have a security clearance. I think that was to come later on in the industry. But at that time, things were pretty wide open.
Okay. And as you progressed, you say you got into engineering, so you started to design circuits? And
Yes, started to do some design work. And then I realized that while it was interesting, I wasn't sure that I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing this. So I basically said I was single, of course, and I said to myself, I'm not doing this for the rest of my life. I told Ray that I was going to leave. And he said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't really know, but I know I'm not going to do this. And so some time went by. Probably I had been gone then about a week or so, and he called me on the phone and he said, do you have another job? And I said, not really. And he said, let's have lunch. So we went, and he said, this company's growing. He said, I'm doing all the sales work and trying to run a company. And he said, it's not working. He said, you obviously know the product. You know how to talk to people. He said, did you ever think about trying to sell the stuff? And I said, no, I never thought of that, but let's talk a little bit more. And we did, and I did. And so I started, basically, I guess I was the first person selling the product in the company that had any idea how it worked. And as I say, the rest is history, because I knew the product, and I think through ham radio, I had no problem talking to strangers or talking on the phone or face to face. So it worked out well, and I never regretted that decision.
Now, the sales process involved interpreting customer needs and helping.
Yes. Normally, when a customer would contact us, it would either be on the phone, we need a box that does this or that, or they'd send in a specification that was prepared that you would evaluate and determine, number one, if you could do it, and number two, how much it was going to cost. And so it relied heavily on the technical aspects. You couldn't just come in off the street, regardless of what sort of education you had, because the technology was so specific. So I was able to do an effective job at evaluating those documents, and also, of course, speaking with customers on the phone. And also, they would come in occasionally to talk about things, or we would go there, and it was an analysis effort of what they wanted versus what we could do, and how much it was going to cost.
Okay. And eventually you had multiple salesmen on the road, or were you?
Well, we eventually, yes, we had, at the peak, I guess, we had two other salesmen at Greenray, and a couple of girls in the office, and it was we had grown at that point to require that, yes.
Okay. So how long were you at Greenray then?
Well, I was at Greenray up until fall of 1982. However, Greenray was starting to experience some issues where Ray pretty much had lost control of the company because it was larger than he had ever anticipated, and he didn't know what to do. And so therefore we started going backwards. And he tried to sell the company a couple times and finally found a person to sell it. And in about 1980, he sold it to a guy named Fred Johnston, who nobody knew at the time was a real piece of work, to coin the phrase. Fred ended up in jail in England for trying to hire a hitman to get rid of one of his partners. And he's now deceased, but he was just a lunatic.
Okay.
And so I ended up getting fired, which was the best thing that ever happened to me. And Bob Ziegler, who was the engineering manager at Piezo a couple of years before that, had a falling out with Ray Green, and of course he got fired. But he went to Piezo because Chuck Jensic was smart enough to realize that he had the keys to the kingdom with the SC cut crystal that they had developed, but they needed a product to go around that, to build the electronics. Bob went and provided that electronics background and a product line, and coincidentally at the time, I had the sales experience to sell that product. So I joined Piezo in the fall of winter of '82, and was then there for another 17 years and ended up being a part owner. And because the people that were working in sales at that time knew how to sell crystals, but they had no idea how to sell a crystal oscillator or even how it worked or what the ins and outs of it were. So it was perfect timing on my part or on their part.
Okay. Now, you mentioned Chuck Jensic.
Yes.
He had become involved in Piezo around that time, or?
I think Chuck came to Piezo in the middle 70s. He came from Motorola in Chicago and came, and I think he started actually as the engineering manager, and then became, with some involvement in the parent company, he became the president.
Okay, right. And he changed the company pretty significantly at that point?
Well, he did, because the company was heavily involved in the two-way radio business when, of course, two-way radio used crystals. And, of course, it supported the Greenrays of the world and those people that used crystals but didn't make them. And he had foresight to utilize this SC cut crystal, which was a relatively new development, which was a very smart move on his part. And of course, then Bob Ziegler came on the scene, and then so that we really capitalized on that. We really, the two-way radio business died on its own, but we didn't look back. We just were happy to move on and put that manufacturing space and personnel into other things that were far more profitable.
Okay. When you say the two-way radio business died, do they no longer use crystals, or?
Well, at that time, a two-way radio in your fire engine or your ambulance or what have you had a number of channels that they could talk to different people. Each one of those channels utilized a crystal for that frequency. Well, then there was the entry of the synthesizer, which of course reduced the number of crystals down to one or two, and then allowed through some microelectronics that you could switch frequencies without switching crystals. And that hastened I won't say the death, but the future demise of the crystal industry in general, because the numbers of crystals just weren't required anymore.
I've heard it stated, for example, in a CB radio, at one point there were maybe 18 or 20 crystals, and when they went to the synthesized, they went to one or two crystals. That
is exactly right, yes,
so
yes.
That market shrank very quickly.
Well, and those crystals, too, were pennies that they were made offshore, along with the radio, so yes, that's very much correct, yes. And of course, the Motorola's and the GE's and the RCA's that made the two-way radios, they started, of course, incorporating the synthesizer right into the radio.
Okay, which they built themselves, I'm sure.
Yes, exactly. That equipment was built in the United States, at least at that time it was.
Okay. Now, not to digress on the story with Piezo, but Piezo at one time was owned by the Sunshine Mining Company and
Yes.
the Hunt Brothers, and went through the whole evolution where they tried to corner the silver market,
Yes.
but spun off the radio business, and it became part of PPA Industries.
Yes.
And then at some point was bought out by the managers or by employees of
Yes,
Piezo.
management team, yes.
When did that take place?
Well, when I joined Piezo in '82, it was owned by PPA Industries, which was Piezo, Premier, and Anchor Chain and Fence. What a conglomeration of companies. But that was the spin-offs that a guy named Dave Crandall was able to get away from Sunshine Mining. Dave had been an officer in Sunshine Mining. The Hunt brothers didn't want those companies. They didn't know anything about them and they didn't care. So Dave, as Chuck always said, pulled a midnight coup and formed PPA Industries, of which Chuck then was a shareholder and president. And it ran until that time, until 1992. Chuck got a group of us together in senior management and said that I want to buy this place. Time is right. PPA needs some cash. This is what I'm planning, and the rest is history. We were able to make it happen, and we owned it until exactly 5 years later. In the fall of '97, we sold it to Oak Industries.
Okay. So to go back to the SC cut.
Yes.
On a crystal, what makes that so special or so different?
Well, the SC cut crystal is far more sophisticated in the way that it's manufactured, and the result of that is that it has much superior warm-up characteristics, and it also has less susceptibility to vibration, degradation, both of which are, I won't say killers, but they're very important parts of the puzzle. And if you can get improved warm-up, where you ovenize a crystal and you can get improved warm-up, and also the vibration sensitivity, it allows you to do some better things with the crystal. But it's not without the expense. It's a much more sophisticated crystal to manufacture, hence it's more expensive. And Piezo became probably the flagship manufacturer of that crystal because we sold them to our competitors. And Chuck always said their money's as green as anybody else's. So we sold lots of SC cut crystals to the Vectrons, to the Oaks. Brian Miller and bought them. We sold lots of SC cut crystals to competitors.
Okay. What made that cut? Was it more difficult to do physically, or?
It was much more difficult in the manufacturing process. There were some extra steps that were required very good X-ray technology in order to orient the crystal properly. And then in the finishing and plating, there were a lot more steps required to make it right. SC, sometimes referred to as stress compensated. That's what SC, I don't know if SC really stands for that, but that's was coined in that phrase. And the SC cut crystal, again, as I said, has the very good warm-up characteristics, particularly because it is free of stresses, or stresses are greatly reduced in a crystal.
Okay. When you say warm-up, that's going into a special application in an enclosure that's heated?
Yes, when the crystal and usually the electronics associated with that are in what's called an oven, and which is a heater that brings everything to a temperature which is above room temperature or the operating temperature range, and stabilizes it very carefully, maybe within 1/10 of a degree, and then that 1/10 of a degree is maintained both with time and temperature. So you could fly it in an airplane or put it in a ship, and it would still maintain that accurate temperature. So that's another part of the technology where the oven has to be very accurate and very stable in its own right.
And Piezo manufactured those?
We made our own ovens, yes. There was a company that was a company that Ray Green started that was called Oven Industries, and they were in Mechanicsburg, and they were around for a while making these component ovens. They didn't last for a lot of reasons, but people then typically were not making ovens, they were buying them from Oven Industries or a company called Oven Air. Isotemp was another one, but then as technology marched on, people just started integrating them all into the same package.
Okay. How big a transition did the workforce have to go through at Piezo to move from the two-way radio crystal business to the?
That's an interesting question, because the crystal industry during the two-way heyday was kind of hammer and chisel, as we used to say. It was a technologically related industry, but it wasn't near what it ended up being during the SC cut days. The techniques were similar, but far more sophisticated in the later days. And I think there were probably people that disappeared that really didn't want to deal with this high precision stuff. They were more interested in doing just a the meatball product, and they left, and I'm speaking at the production level. People just didn't want to deal with it and moved on. But most people were able to adapt. We had some very talented people at Piezo.
Okay. Did they have electronics training, or they just learned on the job, or a mixture of both?
Typically, I was absolutely not. We referred to it as a cottage industry, where these people, Mary, Sally, were doing this forever. They had no idea what they were doing, but they knew how to do it, and they knew how to do it well. Probably they were underpaid based on what the level of technology that they were dealing with, but there were some very, very talented people who had been around for a long time in those fields.
Okay.
And like I say, had no concept of what they were doing.
Okay. And where did those products end up? Did you have a specific market for the ovens, or the?
Well, the industry, or the markets that Piezo attacked, were markets that required this high precision, which was instrumentation. People like Hewlett-Packard would buy those references, as they were referred to, for their test equipment. And we used a lot of Hewlett-Packard equipment in our business, but they bought a lot from us. We put a lot of product into high-end communications equipment for the military and aerospace applications. A lot of black stuff that we didn't really know what was. We were told certain things, and that's all we were told. And so we didn't ask questions. Some of it was for satellite use. Some of it was for just mill applications that we didn't know any more than we were told. And quite frankly, it would have been interesting, but we didn't have the need to know, as they say in the security world. Did a lot of radar applications, some missile applications. It was pretty much a wide variety where high precision was required. We usually could be successful in winning a job.
Okay, so you were dealing with the Department of Defense and space contractors and various.
Yeah, the actual dealing with DoD. We did have contracts with DoD, but for the most part, it was for people like TRW and Rockwell and Hughes and Collins Radio, people that were the major contractor to the DoD, and we were just a subcontractor along with lots of other companies that, as I always said, we made little boxes that went into big boxes, that went into bigger boxes, and then something happened, whether it was a satellite or a radar or whatever, that's what our product was used in.
Okay. So the workforce, was it primarily female, primarily male, or did that vary by job, or?
At the manufacturing level, it was pretty much female, whether they were making crystals or populating printed circuit boards, doing assembly work. That was 95% female. When it got into testing and evaluation and making things actually do what they're supposed to do, that was pretty much a male industry, or a male force.
Okay. It said that the females, if a male and a female both did the same job, they both got the same pay. Was that a correct comment? Or?
I'd like to think that was correct. I was not involved with
Okay.
human resources, but I would like to think that they, yes. And there were several ladies around who were doing things that were predominantly for a male, yes. We used to refer to the ladies as Rosie the Crystal Maker,
okay.
As a takeoff on Rosie the Riveter. And when I first joined there were a couple that were probably around during World War II.
Okay. Did you get to meet any of the first generation crystal people in your career? Or?
Well, I was acquainted loosely with Herman Schau, who of course was one of the original owners of Piezo, and Wally Samuelson, who was his partner. Wally used to come in quite regularly and visit. Allegedly, he was consulting,
okay.
but he would come in and visit, and chatted with him many, many times. And of course, having worked, Ray Green was a pioneer, and Bert Hill, and some of these people that you met along the way. Yeah, you got acquainted with them.
But the Grover Hunts and the P.R. Hoffman?
No, that was before my time.
Okay.
They were names that I was familiar with, but I had no firsthand knowledge of them.
Okay. Were there any legends or traditions or stories that hung with the early years? Or?
Well, the crystal industry was always said was very insidious, that everybody worked for somebody else at some point in their life. And that was pretty much true, that people had worked at other companies along the way. Not really any particular stories, but there were lots of stories about how a particular contract was awarded, and I'm going back to the really old days, how a particular contract may have been awarded or lost, and just some really crazy stories. I can't really quote any right off the top of my head, but I know that there were a lot of stories floating around.
Okay. Apparently those guys weren't regulated by the same rules that we dealt with 30 years later.
I think that's probably true, yes, in a lot of ways, yes, yes.
From the startup, so, okay. So, when you guys took the ownership and then you sold to, was it Oak Industries or was?
It was Oak Industries that we sold to, yes, who owned the facility in Mount Holly Springs, yes.
And that continued to operate for a year or two at the Piezo location?
Yes, and then they sold off to Corning, I guess. I guess Corning was the next one that they sold. Of course, I was gone by then.
Okay.
And they sold off, and then there's been a couple of other people, and it's kind of, I don't know exactly how all that transpired, but I know that when Oak owned a communications laser company in Boston, and Corning wanted that laser company, and Bill Antle, who was the CEO of Oak, said, I'm not selling it, you want it, you buy everything. So that's how the Oak Industries became part of Corning, because he offloaded everything to Corning, and of course they didn't want half the companies, they wanted just this one particular one, and then this is how, I guess, corporations are carved up.
Okay. And that was at the height of the fiber optics boom?
Oh yeah, that was when fiber optics was really becoming the thing, and the communications industry was really on a roll then with the advent of the modern cell phone and the internet and all this kind of communications equipment, yeah.
Okay. So at Piezo, you brought in crystal in raw form?
Yes.
Mostly cultured by that time, I assume?
Yes, yes.
And cut it and finished it to the exact dimensions and then manufactured it into a crystal unit and then put that into the circuitry?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, but you didn't actually culture the quartz?
No, typically the companies that culture or grow the quartz are not manufacturers of the final product. That tends to be a specific industry. So yes, we took the cultured bars, or in some cases we still had applications that used natural, but that was pretty few and far between. And then we would, of course, integrate it. Either we sold the crystal as a finished product, or we put it into our own electronics package.
Okay. Crystals are still in use?
Oh yes, yes.
Do you see that continuing, or do you think there will be a replacement for them, or?
Well, I've been out of the industry for a long time, so I don't have any real firsthand knowledge, but from my own knowledge of what occurred, they're going to be around forever in the high-end applications. The low-end, inexpensive stuff, that there's going to be, and probably is, some technologies that are overtaking that. But in the high-end precision applications, it's going to be around for a while.
Okay. Is there anything unique about your experience that you would like to relate, either at Greenray or at Greenray or at Piezo?
When we sold Piezo, one of the there was a clause, I guess, in the contract that they would basically let us alone for a year, and during that year we had certain profit margin goals that if we could meet, the owners would make more money. And so obviously we all said, sure, we'll do this. Well, it became evident that those numbers were unachievable, and that was just something that they did to keep us around, that Oak did, which is okay. We still got our paycheck and everything was fine. Well, when I left the industry, or left Piezo, I was 50, I don't know, 52 or something, 53, and I knew that I was too young to do nothing. My kids were pretty much out, they were all but out of college, and my wife was a teacher, so I wasn't really, I didn't have to do anything, but I knew I was too young to do nothing. And so I kind of hung around for a while and just thought about things, and I had a good friend who through ham radio, a guy named Dave Smith, who was at Reeves Hoffman, which became CTS Reeves. And he kept bugging me, because this is now cellular industry starting to really go crazy. And, oh, we need you, come work for us. I said, I don't want to work for you. Well, come work for us. So I finally sent my resume in, and of course they hired me on the spot, and I was an applications engineer. And of course working with their major customer, Nortel, on new products. And I found out very quickly that everything that I could possibly think that may have been wrong at Piezo was nowhere near what was wrong over there. That place was an insane asylum. They were more interested in turning business away than they were in getting business. If it wasn't 50,000 pieces, or they weren't interested. And I didn't come up into the industry that way. I learned if you could make money on it, you'd build it. And I lasted all 3 months. I just decided I do not need this. And so I left, and then I went to work at Tektrol in New Cumberland. Perry Bates was the president of that. I went to high school with Perry, and he was another ham radio operator, and he was building specific microwave products for people like Raytheon. They were building Navy radars. And he told me that, he said, I've got some problems you can solve for me. And he said, come work for me. So I did, and I spent 5 years there, and we got a lot done. And then that's when I finally decided, okay, I've had enough. And so it was a tremendous experience. I got to see lots of things all over this country, and traveled in Europe, and got a lot of great experiences as a result of being in that industry. I don't know what I really would have done, to be honest with you, had I not fallen into the frequency control industry.
Does that industry still exist in the United States? Or?
It does, but it's a shell of what it once was. A lot of that technology has either evaporated, sadly, or moved offshore. And of course, a lot of it moved offshore because of the price point that manufacturers were looking to pay for product. And also the government, U.S. government, had a love affair with the Chinese and encouraged everybody to set up a plant in China. And which of course was not the most prudent thing to do, but at the time, everybody wanted to have a plant in China. Well, Chuck Jensic resisted that. We're not setting up a plant in China. And that was a smart thing to do. Yes, it exists, but it's a shell of what it once was. I've often thought, knowing some of the programs that we were involved in, and knowing that some of them still exist to this day, where are they buying the product? Who's making the product that we built, or Oaks, or Vectrons, or whomever that built product? Where are they buying this stuff? And I don't know the answer to that question. It's got to have an impact on the defense posture of this country.
In particular, quartz, as I understand it, is only made by one manufacturer in the United States. And
I guess that's right now. Sawyer in Cleveland, Ohio, was always the flagship manufacturer, and I guess they're still around, and they probably have a corner on the market, yeah.
As I understand it, they have 400 autoclaves and maybe 40 employees, and we get our rust from Russia, which is...
That may very well be true. There was quartz that was manufactured in Russia, and of course, Russia was a source of natural quartz too. The two places in the world where natural quartz was found of electronic grade was in Brazil, of course, and Russia, and of course, both were on again, off again, because it was a natural resource that was depleting, and shipping costs and what have you. But I guess that they can still be had, and of course with the current situation, whether you'd be able to import anything from Russia or not, I don't know. There was a company, Morian Technologies, that was their point person, if you will, for their products in the United States, and I know that they were importing quartz and of course other products.
Any other recollections on the industry? Any high points or unique points from your experience?
Met a lot of great people. Some are still friends to this day. A lot of great experiences, and it was something I don't regret. I had a wonderful experience. I was able to retire at a young age. Very, very, very fortunate to land in Piezo at the right time, and invited by Chuck to participate in ownership. And he knew exactly what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it, and we made it happen. So it was a wonderful experience.
Now, you knew Gilbert Howe?
Oh yes, I knew Gil very well.
And he worked for?
Well, Gil was a longtime employee of Mccoy in Mount Holly, and then when Gil retired, he was primarily a low-frequency crystal engineer, and that was kind of a buggy whip product. It had pretty much disappeared. However, there were still applications that required that product, and he started manufacturing that stuff in his garage and in New Cumberland. And Dave Smith and I used to joke about the fact when you'd go down and walk into his garage that it was the unclean clean room. Gil manufactured that product until his health started to go away, and then he actually shut it down. But Houck and Bowen Engineering was the name of the company, and Kurt Bowen was his partner, but Kurt moved out of the area. But yes, Gil was quite a talented guy. I would say he was one of the pioneers too in the industry.
Okay. And you mentioned illness. Were there any illnesses related to the crystal industry? Were there respiratory illnesses, or did you ever hear stories of that, or was it a dust-free environment?
I don't know of anybody who had any particular illnesses. There was no dust because the cutting of the quartz was done using a fluid, an oil-based fluid, and so the dust that was generated was contained within that fluid, and then of course that had to be properly disposed of because that was considered hazardous, not hazardous as in if you touch it you'll die, but hazardous as in you can't put it down the drain or pour it in your backyard. So I don't know of anybody. We at Piezo occasionally somebody would have a burn from an X-ray machine where they would get their hand where they shouldn't have it, and it would not be a devastating injury. It would just be you got burned like you bumped the stove at your house. But we took great steps to make sure that stuff was safe. But no, I don't know of anyone who ever had any injuries or any long-term effects from the industry.
Anything else that you experienced that was, again, unique? You talked about in a document that I read your early involvement in amateur radio or the ham radio movement and trying to add weight to crystals by writing on them with a pencil or grinding some away.
When I was a kid, and the crystals that we used were called the FT243, which was a World War II vintage crystal that was assembled with 3 screws, and you take it apart, and the crystal blank was compressed between 2 metal plates, and it was called a compression mount. And if you were very careful, you could move the frequency slightly by writing on it with a pencil, which would of course load it and reduce the frequency. And if you were very careful, you could raise the frequency a little bit by using toothpaste. Most times you broke the blank, and I can remember doing that as a kid. In retrospect, what we were trying to do was pointless because the amount that you could move it didn't warrant all the effort that you were going to go to. But yes, that's and actually in industry, a crystal is when they're plated with silver or gold to lower the frequency, or some of that is etched away to raise the frequency. So the technique is basically the same. It's done in a far more sophisticated manner, and it's used with gold or silver plating, and then some acid that will actually remove a portion of that plating. It's all about what they call mass loading, which you add to or subtract from to get it on frequency.
And was that mass loading, was that the total mass of the crystal, or did that relate more specifically to the thickness?
Well, when a crystal is designed, it's designed with a particular thickness and diameter ratio to achieve a certain frequency. There's some tables that have been ginned up over the years, and they knew that if they were going to have a blank that was 7/10 of an inch in diameter and it was going to be a 7 megahertz crystal, it had to be X thickness. When a crystal was manufactured, it was always manufactured high in frequency so that it could be plated down. And so that would be the mass loading then. So when you add the electrodes and then some additional loading to get it on frequency. So any crystal starts life high and then is eventually finished down through the mass loading technique.
And each crystal requires very specific adjustment to get it to?
Yes. Each of those crystals are individually set on frequency, to coin a phrase. Some techniques were a little more automated than others, but it could be as simple as Mary sitting there, taking the individual crystal and dipping it into nickel and plating it for 8 seconds or whatever her table told her, plugging it into then and monitoring the frequency, and she knew what the parameters were and what the window is that she had to work through.
Okay. So each crystal at the end was, for lack of a better word, say calibrated by a human being that...
It was, the very sophisticated ones were done with some automation, but they were, each individual crystal, yes, was evaluated, whether it was set on by human hands or set on by some automation. Yes, but it was determined that a person made the decision that, yes, this is good or this is bad, and yes.
Okay. Now, you came from the area, so moving or working in the Carlisle area was kind of natural. How would it have been for somebody that, say, grew up in Chicago and moved to Carlisle? How did they find the area? Was Carlisle a good place for them, or?
I think, and I knew people over the years who moved into the area, and they always liked the area because it was a calm, safe area, and good schools, whether they were in the Carlisle area or went to some of the other surrounding areas. I think they were happy with it. A person, if they were coming from outside the area into the crystal industry, they pretty much had to know what they were getting into as far as the business was concerned. It wouldn't be the same as if you were going to go work for an insurance company or something like that. It's a very specific industry, and if you came in from someplace else, you pretty much now, like Chuck Jensing, for example, came from Chicago, but Chuck was a crystal engineer for Motorola, so he pretty much knew what he was getting into. Right,
so he moved for the career rather than for the town.
Yes, exactly.
But the town did not work against the industry, were there?
No, I think from everything, of course, I didn't live in Carlisle, but I never heard anything that the town did to hurt the crystal industry, because it was such a large employer. Either the actual manufacturing industry or some of the other allied companies that were around to support it, because at one time there were a lot of people, as you well know, that were involved in that. So I've never heard anything about anything that was cast negatively towards that industry.
Because if I'm correct, I think Chicago was a crystal manufacturing hub, and maybe Kansas City.
Kansas City was a major hub also. And Chicago, pretty much, because Motorola made a lot of their own crystals. There was some work in Florida, in Orlando, Oklahoma City. So there were little pockets, and they could, I always said that if you took a whiteboard and started in Carlisle and started drawing colored lines here, there, and everywhere, it would, who knows what it would look like, but it would be crazy, because everybody was related to somebody else, or worked here or worked there, and this person left and started that company.
Okay. And that's one thing, as I've talked to other people, there used to be degrees in materials design or
material science.
We don't seem to have those specialties anymore to teach people the industry. The industry is not big enough to, I guess, attract that attention anymore.
Well, people that were doing actual engineering of the crystal product, a lot of them came with a physics background.
Okay.
The engineering manager at Piezo was Dr. Bill Hansen, who had his education was in material science, but now you're talking obviously some time ago also. But physics and electrical engineering would be the two areas. I guess there were probably some chemistry people, and there were a lot of people who just, as myself, rub off engineers just for being around.
Was there a certification process for that, or just the experience spoke? And
no, that was the crystal industry and the oscillator industry as a whole was very, very heavily experience related. There were lots of people who were very successful that had really no credentials other than maybe some rudimentary military education in electronics or something like that, but ended up doing some very responsible things just because they were around forever and rubbed elbows with the right people and paid attention when they were being shown things.
And in your particular case, you were in the Air National Guard in
Yes.
communications and got some additional training
Yes.
in that
Yes.
regard. And you've also published several academic papers.
I wrote a couple of papers along the way, simply because there was a get-together every year called the Frequency Control Symposium, and it floated around the country, different places, and every year, and there was a European Frequency Control Symposium, and of course, the purpose was for the industry to get together and share knowledge, and although sometimes I wondered if they really shared it all, but, and there were papers presented on various aspects of the industry, and we had people at Piezo that presented papers. In fact, Chuck used to, had an incentive, if you want to present a paper, he'll make it worth your while to present that paper because it was free advertising for Piezo. And I attended these things over the years, and I'm sure there were some really, really great sessions, but to me, a lot of it was, look how smart I am, and I'm going to tell you about this very obscure particular thing that I've been spending a lot of time on. Couple that with hours and hours of meetings with customers and telephone conversations and a lot of asking the same questions over and over and over. So I decided to write a couple of papers on just some background. I wasn't trying to impress anybody with my credentials because I really didn't have any, but I tried to answer a lot of questions that were just asked over and over. And so I did that and presented them in a couple of sessions in the country, and got a lot of good comments because there was some solid basic information. It wasn't look how smart I am paper. And so I was pretty proud of that I wrote these, and they were published, and in fact published a couple different places, and I think they served their purpose. And every once in a while, I remember I would pick up an article, or it was written by somebody else, and I'd see that I was quoted in there with a footnote. I always felt pretty good about that.
Yeah, that is kind of exciting.
Yes.
I've experienced, not on an electronic standpoint, but
Yes.
it's nice to be included in the book.
And my wife, of course, taught high school English, and I would drag this thing home, and I would ask her to look at it, and she would say, I have no idea what I'm looking at, but she maybe occasionally would plug in a period or a comma.
But it is a satisfying feeling to be published in this.
Yes.
Now, do you have any patents?
Oh, no.
And I talked to Chuck, and I asked, locally, there were companies that patented a lot of things, and they made a big deal out of it, and I never saw that Piezo really patented anything. And
Piezo probably had, in my tenure, 4 or 5 patents on some very specific kinds of product. I think they were predominantly done just because we could do them, and it was good advertising to have a product that was patented. Sadly, none of the things that we patented were terribly successful in the business world, because they were very obscure, and hence a patent could be had. Because if you look at the overall crystal industry, there was many things that were done that couldn't be patented because they were done forever by many, many companies. But there were a couple things that we had patented were, as I say, very, very specific things. So we had probably 4 or 5 patents that had various people's names on them.
I've kind of heard indicated that if you did the patent, you kind of gave away the secret. And
yes, and one of the things that Chuck always used to say was, if you got a patent, then you had to defend it. And luckily, what we were doing, nobody ever really, we really weren't making any money off of it anyway, so if somebody wanted to steal it, more power to them. And then we learned that there were U.S. patents, and then there were international patents. So if we had a U.S. patent and the Chinese wanted to steal it, which they probably already did, that was even more complicated to defend it. So we just kind of did what we did and didn't worry about it. It was, nobody ever really did anything with our patents that we were aware of, and certainly didn't make any money off of them.
Okay. Anything else that you recall that
Well, one of the things that I remember that we had to do, we built some product for a company in Germany that was building television satellite that was going to hang over Switzerland, and it was going to be to provide broadcast to certain parts of Europe, and we built some product that went into that. Well, that led to us obtaining a munitions license, if you can believe that we could have exported ammunition and landmines that was all inclusive, and it was because it was built by a foreign company. We were exporting product that was going into space, and so we had to get an export license, and it was reams of paperwork, and we had to, of course, maintain that. It had nothing, what we built that went to Germany had nothing to do with munitions and with armaments, but we had, somebody decided that we had to have that license, so we did. And so I remember we had to keep that munitions license current every year and renew it for a lot of money every year, but we pretty much had to have it. Sometimes, or a lot of times in the black community, we didn't know where this stuff was going, so we didn't have to worry about that. They took care of all that stuff. But there was a lot of ancillary things that happened over the years that you wouldn't think would be involved with the frequency control industry or the crystal industry.
And that was again because of the security and the defense nature of the work?
Yes, the government got very concerned about some things, some technologies that were leaving the United States. We had an inquiry from some institute in China for a very sophisticated box to do certain things, and we decided that well, if we're going to quote it, we're going to make some money on the deal. Of course, accepting the order was contingent upon obtaining an export license. So we quoted it, and we received word that they wanted to buy it. So I executed all the paperwork, which went to the Commerce Department to receive an export license. And if I recall correctly, they had 10 days to respond, either by saying no or giving us the export license. Well, they didn't respond, so I checked with them. Well, we sent that, and I don't remember which came first, State Department or Defense Department. We sent that off to them. The long story short was they punted to the other firm or the other organization who never responded. So we never could get an export license, and after about 45 days of shuffling our feet, we just wrote back and said we can't get an export license, and because it was China, and what we were building, they didn't want to issue. Nobody wanted to issue a license yet. On the other hand, you have to love the Chinese. They're our new partners, and of course this is all happening in the 80s and the 90s. And so we never did accept the order because we couldn't have built it or couldn't have shipped it legally. And every time I hear somebody talking about the love affair with China, that comes into my mind, because if you talk to the right people in the government, it's not a love affair.
Well, I can remember even in the 70s, it was common to see pictures in the newspaper of foreign companies coming here and touring our plants, and we were sharing information. And
we were approached by a major Japanese company, and they wanted to enter into a teaming arrangement, and so they wanted to visit. So they came in one day, and there were 4 or 5 of them, and the first thing that became evident was they were trying to pull a fast one, because they could speak English, but only when they wanted to, and they would sit there and chat back and forth in Japanese, which of course was A, rude, and B, not necessarily the right thing to do. Long story short, Chuck asked them to leave, and we just said, no, we're not interested, and they were not happy, because they thought that they could tell us what we were going to do and how we were going to do it, and it was going to be a teaming arrangement. Of course, they were going to be calling all the shots, and Chuck said no. So we showed them the door, and they weren't happy, and life went on.
Mm-hmm. Probably to your benefit.
Oh, absolutely, because they would have gotten their fingers in us, and then who knows what would have happened.
I worked as a safety consultant in the insurance industry, and I went to a factory where they made pierogies, and I wasn't allowed to go into the room where they had designed their own machine to put the pierogies together, and they wouldn't let anybody in, ever. And apparently somebody had actually posed as an insurance safety consultant trying to get in. And so always was sensitive to that afterwards. And the other highly secretive place, not like the crystal industry that I got into, is a place that makes little candy treats out of powdered sugar and water and air. And they had a special machine, and I had to sign non-disclosure. But I would see that in the newspapers and just wonder, they had to have cameras and recorders and a lot of things to steal our technology.
Oh, I'm sure, yes. And we had things that were, well, they weren't classified, they were sensitive, and they were sensitive to us. It was equipment that we built or equipment that we had modified. And so there were times that we deemed it maybe not necessary to take a customer or propose a prospective customer into the plant, or we may take them one particular area and not show them other things. Again, as you say, the proprietary procedures and equipment, because one of the things that in the crystal industry was such that being a relatively small industry in the larger scheme of things, a lot of equipment was not really made for that industry. So we had some people that dreamed up ways to modify existing equipment, maybe from the optics industry or other places where we cut the end off and welded another end on and machined this down and came up with something that would work for us. And so while not secret or proprietary, it was sensitive. And we had a lot of equipment like that. That's one of the things that Oak wanted when they bought us. They knew that some of the stuff that we had or what it was capable of doing, and they wanted that technology.
Does that technology survive to your knowledge?
I don't know. I really don't know. It should have. It was good solid technology at the time, and it was all related to the high-end product, so it should. Now whether they did it, I think with it, I don't know.
Okay. All right. Any other recollections that you have of the industry or that would be of interest to people in future generations that we didn't talk necessarily about the machining process? That's been, I think, documented, but
Right.
The process of crystal manufacturing is pretty straightforward in
It is, yes.
terms of cutting and getting it to that proper size, but very complicated in the details.
Yes, you're exactly right. The overall concept is pretty straightforward, but when you get into the details, then it does get to be very tedious and very specific, and it has to be done a particular way. And as I said, there were people that were doing this that have been doing it for decades and had no idea what they were doing, or the complexity of what they were doing. They knew they were taught to do this process, and they did it. And for that reason, the crystal industry overall in the electronics community was always very misunderstood. People would refer to it as just a crystal. It's just a crystal. Well, it's not just a crystal. And people constantly complain, well, how can it cost that much? And we've got to make it cheaper. Well, gee, we can't. And because it was a misunderstood industry by the users, if you will.
And even within the electronics and engineering field?
Oh, yeah. You would have customers, like I said, a Hughes or a Lockheed or somewhere, and we'd make oh my goodness, it can't cost that much. Well, it does. And then they would go looking around, and if you could find somebody else that could do it, it probably was a similar type of price.
I guess there's no average price for something that you made at that point in time that would compare to today's market?
No, I would have no basis to respond to that question, no. I know that today it would be referred to as popcorn today. It'd be pretty inexpensive, but a lot of the stuff that we made was pretty, excuse me, it's pretty sophisticated.
You guys got to, I think it was $15 million in sales by 2000?
I think we were doing, when we sold the place, excuse me, yeah, it was about 15, 16.
And how many employees would you have had at that point?
Oh, probably 225, something like that.
Okay, so you're doing 400,000 or 500,000 an employee, which is,
I never did the math.
get that through. But the wages were good and the benefits were good.
Yeah, we had a lot of people that had been around for a long time. So yes, it was a good industry to be in, and of course, and most recently with Chuck Jensik. Chuck was a great manager.
I believe, was the workforce predominantly white, or was it integrated, or did that change with time, or?
No, there were a few African-American employees, women, that were there, and the whole time I was there, had been around for a long time and had pretty responsible jobs, but it was predominantly white and very, very heavily female.
Okay. I guess in today's world, 40 years later, to ask about harassment or treatment, was it a worker-friendly environment? Were there issues, do you think, or?
I think that there were, of course, I'm not being involved in human resources and not really getting any firsthand knowledge of that. I don't recall any real problems. I know that the company wouldn't have tolerated it. I know we had one situation where we used, of course, a lot of gold in the manufacturing process, and there was a woman on the second shift that was pilfering gold, and of course, we started the usage of gold went up, and they started doing a little research and found out that it was Mary, and Mary was given an opportunity to take a hike, and she did, but that was just being stupid. But because Chuck probably would have lent her the money if she really needed money that badly. But I don't recall ever really being any serious problems.
Yeah, I've never heard of any, but I just was, it's curious as times have changed and what it would have been like, say, even in World War II. But Piezo at one point had a plant in, I think, Louisville. But that was closed, I guess, by the time you got here, or?
It was just closing.
Okay.
And that was built to support the two-way radio business because it was a fair number of people in the industry in general that came over the mountain from Perry County, and Piezo, as I was told, decided that, well, if some of these people wouldn't come to Carlisle to work, but they may work if it was in their backyard. So the Louisville plant was built, and I guess it served the purpose that it was built for, but then when that part of the industry went away, it just became an albatross, and it was eventually sold in. When I first joined Piezo, there was a shuttle up in the morning and one in the afternoon taking product and equipment and what have you back and forth. That was an everyday event.
Okay. Yeah, at that point in time, Carlisle was probably, was fully industrialized and full industrial employment. There were a couple thousand people in the crystal industry, then there were a couple thousand people at Maslin's and Tire and Rubber and Frog Switch, and so labor would have been an issue, I'm sure, and you weren't directly involved in production, how difficult it was to hire people or find qualified people to work, but...
Well, when things were really going crazy, it was difficult to get people. We had a third shift going for a while, and it was difficult. And then when I went over to Reeves Hoffman for the CTS Reeves for a short time, they had the same personnel issues, and they'd be dragging people through on new hires on company tours, and you'd kind of just cringe at some of these people. Where in the world did they find these people that were going to work on third shift or whatever? At one time, or at certain times, personnel were a problem finding people.
And a person didn't sit down and start from day one to be productive.
No, there was an education process to learn what it was that you were supposed to be doing, and if you didn't have the desire to do it right, you weren't going to succeed. You had to do what you were instructed to do, and because it couldn't be sloppily done, it had to be done the way it was supposed to be done. There was a reason for everything that occurred.
And Piezo never unionized.
No.
And the only major union operation was, I guess, Hunt, which became Marauder Erie, and they were the first to go.
I'm not sure I don't know if they were actually unionized or not. They may be right. I know that it was rumored from time to time that this place was on the verge of organizing, but it never really happened to my knowledge. You may be correct.
So there was never any activity or really talk of that by you?
Not during my tenure at Piezo.
Okay. Anything else that you can recall, Glenn? You've turned in quite a collection of materials today to the society, which is...
Well, it was my museum that I had at home, and I had an occurrence at home. We had a washing machine failure, and it overflowed and leaked down into my basement workshop, and there was a lot of water all over everywhere, and kind of forced me to start looking at some of this stuff and find a home for it, because it's not worthy of a dumpster when I leave this earth. So I got things together, and somebody else might learn something from it.
It's very much appreciated, because as big as the industry was, it didn't leave many artifacts behind.
Yes, and that's very disappointing. When I was here when you did your presentation and looked at that display case, and I thought, and we were here, of course, I guess last summer when we donated the sign to Piezo for what the industry was in this area, and this is all that can be mustered up as a display. It's pretty sad.
And sadly, we don't have that many photographs either. There are a number of advertising brochures which have pictures from inside the facilities, but they're not high quality. When we scan them, we don't get a high quality.
Yes.
The originals that we have are often just snapshots, and they don't, so it would be hard to come in and reconstruct the processes.
I had a carousel of 35 millimeter slides that I took at Piezo in preparation for a customer visit in France, and they were great slides and showed everything. I don't know what happened to them. I mean, they were in my desk when I left, and who knows, there was a carousel of slides. I have no idea what happened to them. But yes, brochures and all that, I can think of catalog collections that I have. Of course, being in sales, you've always gathered up the competitors' literature, and I had a file cabinet full of all sorts of stuff, and of course that's sure in a dumpster by long ago.
Yeah, so again, very much appreciated. And is this process as well, we hope to get other people to come in and give their stories, and to expand some of the names. There were a lot of people that provided leadership, Shale and Samuelson. And
the names that you presented in your presentation and your pre-World War II history was just fascinating, because there were names that I was familiar with and some that I wasn't, but how some of them were all fit together were very interesting. I certainly had no knowledge of that pre-World War II, and then only after World War II some of it becomes a little more clear. And anybody that spent any time in the industry knew of those names, or some of those names, and how things fit together.
And the connection to amateur radio is pretty significant too. At the beginning, with the students at the college that kind of got the first crystal activity going, and then a lot of the people that gravitated to the industry, especially in that first and what I call the second generation into the 60s, also had that amateur radio background.
Yes.
They had actually got into it, and of course yourself with that story, and I like the story with your dad's car battery where you drove the nail in to get the 6 volts.
It worked for a while.
Yeah.
We had a bank that we referred to, and it was hundreds of drawers of crystals that were in individual boxes that were marked, in small boxes that were marked with particular contracts on them, and they could be traced to a particular set of specifications. And they were sorted and categorized in these file cabinets. Well, we'd used that for a number of reasons. One, some of it was overreach from an order, and a customer may have bought 10 crystals and they'd call up and say, do you have 2 more? Well, if we had 2 more, sure, we'll sell them to you. And of course, it was very profitable to do that. But we also kept crystals that just didn't quite meet the specification. They fell out for a particular reason. We kept those also and had them categorized, simply because many times a customer would call up and say, hey, I'm working on a new project. Do you have anything that's such and such that you can ship me quick for this, that I'm working on this? Well, of course, that may lead to some business, so sure, let me check. And we would gladly give the guy a couple crystals to do experimentation with. However, you talk about the ham radio, people knew that I was a ham, and they would collar me at a club meeting or somewhere, hey, can you get me a crystal that does such and such and such and such? And let me check. And I would, of course, give people a crystal. If I had it, I would give it to them. But I would always have a caveat, is that I don't ever want to hear you on the radio telling somebody that Glenn got me this crystal, because I don't need 500 people calling me on the phone looking for handouts. I have other things to do. Right. And so people were, okay, I hear you. But we would gladly provide them to a customer for a project that they may be working on. And I know Tektrol right now, Tektrol of course is closed, and Perry's trying to sell the building. Well, I was down there on Saturday, and he's got some boxes of cast-offs that I gave him decades ago, and they're just where I gave them, sitting in the corner, hundreds and thousands of crystals that were unusable for whatever reason. So we didn't throw things away unless they were really, really bad for some reason. But if they were close, we kept them because they may have had some value to a future customer. And it was, of course, very advantageous to be able to say, sure, I'll put it in the mail to you and you'll have it in a day or two. Right. And rather than have to order a crystal. And many times if it was close, that's all they needed for a project.
I had an uncle that worked for Reeves Hoffman, and I could get crystals for my fire scanner free, but it took a week or two, which was not bad, but interesting. Okay, well, unless you have any other thoughts, I really appreciate this. I think this has been valuable. And
it's a great experience. There's a lot of memories flooding back as we're talking, and I hope that somebody gets some value out of this at some point in time.
Yeah. Hopefully too, and I've learned to say culture, not synthetic.
There you go.
Blair, do you have any questions or ideas?
The only thing that I was thinking of is, you mentioned you wrote those papers based on just some, I guess, basic misunderstandings or questions that a lot of customers would have for you. And you mentioned early on that you got started in sales and people would come to you and say, and you kind of worked together in terms of figuring out what was needed. I'm wondering, did that process change at all during the course of your career when you started out in sales versus when you ended?
Not particularly different. I was always the point man for the company if a customer would come to us with a new application that they needed. And so it was my job to try to ferret through their understanding of what they needed versus what could be done, because there were many times customers would have these off-the-wall requirements that, sorry, we can't do that, and by the way, nobody else can either. So in that regard, no, it didn't really change. A lot of the specifications and the capabilities became more and more sophisticated, but the trying to determine what the customer needed, prepare a proposal, work out the costs, that was always the mechanism.
The reason I ask is it just sounds like a very unique sales position, where you're not really going out and selling something to a customer. You're more so, it's more of a collaborative process. 100%,
and I've always said that, yes, I worked in the sales world, but I was not a car salesman. I was not selling appliances or selling lumber. I was selling a technology that could be tailored towards a particular application. No, I didn't want to become a car salesman or any other sort of salesman, because sales there was a collective term, but it wasn't really, it was more, the guys that worked for me, we used the title as applications engineer, because that's more what it was. You were in the sales world, but you were working with the customer from an application standpoint. What do they need? What can we do? And how much is it going to cost? And when can we deliver it? And it was a very technical. You had to understand the product. And the guys at Piezo that worked for me came from out in the plant. They were guys that were working on the product, and they had the wherewithal to know what they what they knew it well, and like me, they had the confidence to get on the phone and talk to a customer, and they've done very well.
One thing that impresses me in that process is the degree of pride that the people I've talked to took in the jobs that they did.
Oh my
Great
goodness.
amount of enthusiasm and a high level of ownership. They didn't work there, they kind of thrived there, maybe would be a better way to
Yes,
put it.
yes, the pride and workmanship was very important. A person who did not have pride in what they did wouldn't last. And we, at Greenray as well as at Piezo, you had to be pretty careful about what the people in the plant knew about what was going on, because if we were going into a missile or a radar or something, it was some defense-related type thing, they may not have seen eye to eye with the political aspects of all that, and so you just didn't say a lot about things. And I remember particularly in Desert Storm, when that happened in 1991, if you recall, the U.S. Arsenal hadn't had anything from Vietnam to really test new weapons platforms. And I can remember coming in the morning and getting a cup of coffee with Chuck Jensick in the conference room and a couple other people. Hey, did you see on the news last night where they fired so-and-so and it did exactly, well, we had something in that, whatever it happened to be. And it wasn't just the crystal industry, it was the electronics industry in general that got to see things that they had been working on and got to see it work, whether it was a radar or a missile or whatever. But you couldn't really tell people too much about that because it just had to be, you wouldn't want Sally and Mary getting upset.
Yeah, and that's one thing that was mentioned after Vietnam was that the politics and the protests, had those people known what we were doing in the local crystal industry, they would have probably been marching around those buildings, but they didn't understand.
Yes.
Which was fortunate. And
Yes. We, at Greenray, we built a particular box for Westinghouse, and it was for a jamming pod that went on an aircraft. And I remember distinctly getting a phone call from the contact that we had at Westinghouse that said that they uncovered a chink in the armor, I guess, if you will. The North Vietnamese uncovered this chink, and they all of a sudden the U.S. aircraft that were using this particular jammer were now susceptible to being shot down. And they had an all stops out order from the Air Force to modify this particular pod and get it back to Vietnam. Could we build a version of X, Y, and Z that we had been building? Could we modify it to do thus and so? And it was frequency adjustment. It wasn't any other change in specifications. And build a handful of them and get them to down there overnight. You know, we'll pay anything. The famous "we'll pay anything." So what did we? Sure, we get on the phone with Piezo at that time, and we need some crystals, blah blah blah, and you know, you got to do it. No cost is not a factor. Well, everybody did what they were supposed to do. They got these jammers back into Vietnam, and everything worked out. But I remember that distinctly, where there was something was discovered that was needed to be dealt with, and it needed to be dealt with now, not 6 weeks from now. And so Piezo supported us, we supported Westinghouse, and then it went into this pod, and it went back to Vietnam.
and none of that was known locally.
Oh, no, nobody knew anything was happening. As was when the Apollo 11 camera that was built by Westinghouse, and Greenray had a little box in that camera, and the crystal was built by Piezo. And that was a last minute, not that people usually don't know this, but that camera that they took to the surface was not planned. It was a last minute, let's build a camera and take it along. Westinghouse had the ability to build that contract. We got a phone call, we had to build an oscillator that did X, Y, and Z, but we need it now. And so we got a hold of Piezo, and they built the crystal overnight. We built the box. It went to Westinghouse, and it went to the lunar surface. And now that was not a defense related, but still it was one of those that happened very quickly, and because money was not an object. And when somebody asks you to build something that's going to go to the lunar surface, you listen.
Right.
So we made it happen. And I will tell you one thing in that product. This was a little little box that was about 1 by 2 inches that went into this camera. And I had the bright idea that before we put the lid on and sealed it up, I went around to every person in the company with a scribe and had them put their initials on the inside of the lid. And Ray Green and I put our ham radio call letters on in there instead of our initials, because this was going to the lunar surface, and it's still sitting up there now where they left it behind. And so everybody that was working at the company, all 30 people or so at the time, had their initials in that. We put the lid on it and we shipped it, and it went to the lunar surface. So
That's a great story. That's something that, you ought to write a little article.
well, there was an article in the Ham Radio magazine, I don't know, 20 years ago or something, on the anniversary of that Apollo landing, and this particular ham had said that he worked for a company that built a box that went into the lunar module, and he claimed to be the first ham on the moon, because they did the same thing. And so I wrote in and I said, not so fast. I said, you're not the only one. And then I explained what we did. And so I guess there were 2 groups of hams that were on the lunar surface.
But just to think to do that was,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, yeah, talk about ownership.
Well, and I had the opportunity to go down to Baltimore to the Westinghouse facility and see the camera in final assembly. I had to put the white coat on and the hat and everything and go in. And I remember seeing that camera, and that was pretty amazing. That was one of the high points, I think, of my career, to go in there and see that camera being assembled. And by today's technology, it was meatball compared to today, but it was pretty neat.
But most of what you're talking about is still the age of discrete components?
Yes,
Not
yes.
chips and not,
Yes, it was discrete components, yes. That's why it was 1 inch by 2 inch.
Right.
Today would probably be the size of your thumbnail, yeah.
it's, the industry locally kind of missed that era though, right? I guess, or did we get into microchips and?
Well, the industry started doing what's called thick film. They weren't making chips per se, but they were using thick film technology. And of course, Mount Holly does that, and Greenray is doing that technology today. And of course, the oscillators are a fraction of the size of what they were at one time. That's a whole different manufacturing technology. And I guess there's even some thin film. That's all a very sophisticated microelectronic, but that's where the industry went.
But you can't really put a quartz crystal.
Well, they put a blank in there. They put a blank in, and then they attach it. And so there's one there, but not the one that I grew up with.
Right, okay.
It's there. Different world. Totally different world.
And we've gotten very thin to get to the ultra-high frequencies, the 3200 megahertz or whatever.
Innovative frequency control products. John Kent was a pioneer in that world, and yes, he had a technology that allowed you to get very high in frequency. And we had some of his crystals when Dave Smith, that I mentioned, worked for him. He got us some stuff that was just some samples that didn't quite meet the spec that they were supposed to, but they were good enough for us. And we did some experimenting with them and had some thoughts of doing this or that. It never really went anywhere. That was a very, very specific technology. And I don't think that John ever had the funding to really develop it. They were kind of on a shoestring, and it just kind of didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, well, they sold out to Valpy.
Yes, they sold out to Valpy, yes. Who's still around?
Yeah. Dave Smith, did he go in the crystal business on his own?
No. Dave actually left education for the crystal industry. And then he finished his career outside the industry. But he worked at Innovative, and he worked at Murata.
I'm thinking there was a person bought Gil Hauck's. Was that Edward?
I think it was Ed. His father was Bob Smith, and Bob Smith was the local government inspector. He hung his hat at Reeves Hoffman, but if you had a job that required a government sign off on it, he was the guy that came around and looked at the test data and asked you to repeat this test or do that or whatever. And Bob was a good guy. he was a legend in the industry. Although he never worked in the industry, he was the inspector and was really a wonderful man. And I think then it was his son then that ended up, I think his name was Ed, if I recall correctly. In fact, Bob was I knew that Bob was a World War II veteran, but I never knew much about it. And one time on Pearl Harbor Day, they had a ceremony on the steps of the Capitol, and it was on the news, and I thought, son of a gun, there's Bob Smith standing there. And I asked him, and he was at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked. And he was actually a civilian working for the government, and he was at Pearl Harbor. He was a very, very nice man, but boy, don't cross him. If he had a sense of how you handled your contracts in your business, he was easy to get along with, but don't try to pull a fast one on him because he'd kill you. And he was a good guy.
Yeah, Ed Smith sold to a company in Hollidaysburg, I guess.
Yeah, Anderson Electronics.
They're still in business, yeah.
As far as I know, they are, yeah. And that's a company that Bill Anderson was the one that I was loosely acquainted with. His father was in the Army at the War College and worked in the industry at night. And he worked at, I think it was Mccoy, and he was not there as a War College as a student. He was an enlisted man at some point in his career, and he worked in the industry to get some extra money at night. And then he started, when he got out of the Army, and he started Anderson Electronics.
Oh, okay.
And his son was Bill, which was the one, like I say, that I was loosely acquainted with. Dave Smith had worked for them too as a sales guy. They had a nice facility out there, which I assume they still do.
Yeah, as of a couple months ago, I talked to a person out there to get information on Ed because he had sold to them. And then there was a George Beislein that I guess set up a factory in a local abandoned church but never produced anything, or...
George never was trying to produce crystals. George was I'm not sure he was the engineering manager. He had a very senior position at Mccoy. And George got into brokering of manufacturing equipment. And he had that church down there on Route 74, right behind the mall there.
Okay.
And apparently, I'd never been in it, but I was always told that it was stuffed full of equipment. And apparently, he was doing this, and he was making some real money at it. And Luther McCoy found out about it, and that was the end of him working at McCoy. So then he was in business full time. And where I met him was I knew who he was, and I had picked up a piece of crystal manufacturing equipment at a ham radio flea market down in Maryland. And I wasn't 100% sure what it was, but I knew the industry that it came from, and I knew it was worth more than the $17 that I paid for it. And I remember buying it from this guy who had clearly got it surplus somewhere, and I was lugging it back to the car, and my friend said, "What do you want with that piece of junk?" And I said, "It's not necessarily junk, stay tuned." Long story short, I called him. I was at Greenray at the time, and I called him, told him what I had, and he said, "Come up to my house after work." And I went up and we made a deal, and I made a lot more than $17 on the deal, and which started a kind of a relationship, because I was very much going to ham radio flea markets, and he said, and he gave me a list of stuff. He said, "If you ever see any of this stuff, grab it." And I was able to pick up some stuff here and there, and so I made a few dollars along the way, and he was happy, and I guess he's been going now for years.
Yeah. It's probably at least 2000, but maybe before.
Well, maybe even longer than that.
Yeah, he lived on Belvedere Street.
Yes, exactly. I remember looking for his house. Yes, he was another legend in the industry, yeah.
Now, did you meet Luther McCoy?
I never met Luther. Heard a lot about him, but never met him.
He was kind of interesting. Very successful, and his company survived. So.
I heard he had worked at Piezo at one time, but that was just what I had heard.
Yeah, when he worked for Hoffman, I have to look at the book to remember the order, but he tried to start his own company in 1943, and about 5 South Hanover Street had got the equipment, had everything set up, and then the War Production Board wouldn't let him start, couldn't get help. So he sold his equipment to Reynolds Hoffman, P.R. Hoffman, who immediately hired people and started to use it to produce crystals. So it was, I guess, politics during the war, but... And then
one thing you said in your presentation when you talked about Reeves Hoffman, of course, the Reeves in Reeves Hoffman was Reeves Sound Labs. Mm-hmm. A guy named Hazard Reeves was a ham.
Okay.
And in fact, he was a pretty famous ham also. And I knew that when you spoke about it that night, but it just was one of those things that was buried in the back of my brain. But yes, Hazard Reeves, I always thought, what a name, Hazard.
Yeah. Well, and then they were part of Claude Neon, which was, I guess, a French company involved in... That
was news to me. I hadn't never known that.
Yeah, and then they became Dynamics Corporation of America,
right.
But it was kind of a...
And that was another case where companies ended up with companies that really didn't want them. Mm-hmm. They just sort of ended up with them because of other deals that were made, and they came along with them.
Yeah. Then Dynamics Corporation tried to take over CTS, and that didn't go well, and ended up in litigation. Then CTS took over Dynamics, and
right.
That was the end of us locally. But yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Well, CTS, of course, was in the building there on North Street, Reeves and CTS, and then when that shut down, of course, Dickinson College ended up with that building, and Dr. Bill Hansen, who was the engineering manager at Piezo, had a company. He was a Dickinson alumni, so they gave him floor space in there to start his company, which didn't make it, and it was not related to the frequency control industry. But and then I guess after he moved out, then they changed it now into what it is now,
right.
With offices and I don't know if there's any classrooms in there or not, but
I think there are. It's kind of a hybrid building. There's some class space. There's some quiet spaces.
Well, I know that when I during my short tenure there, we would go out the back door and across the railroad tracks to the Dickinson faculty cafeteria. Mm-hmm. And I remember the first or second day, the guy said, "Hey, we're going to get some lunch. You come." So we went out and walked down the railroad tracks. Where are we going? Oh, we're going to the Dickinson faculty cafeteria. Well, how are we getting in there? You just walk in, and your money's as good as anybody else's. So we would go over there quite a bit for lunch, and it was the faculty cafeteria.
Yeah. I guess you looked good enough that...
Well, yeah, we weren't looked like bums, I guess, so we were... Nobody ever said a word. I was over there many times in that short tenure for lunch. But they... and then, of course, Dickinson then changed it into what they wanted it.
Right. Yeah, and Piezo is now the exhibit center for the auto shows.
Yes. In fact, shortly after that building was converted to its current use, my wife and I went to, I think it was one of those over 50 senior citizen things. Not that we had a lot of interest in that, but I wanted to see what the building looked like. So we went in, and of course the building is totally gutted. And I remember standing there looking up at the overhead, and I could tell by certain structure, and I said, I think my office was about here. And then I talked to whoever the person was in charge there and told them that I once worked there, and oh my goodness, and so they were asking me a bunch of questions and showing me some stuff behind the scenes, and it was very interesting. It was a nice building.
It's interesting, the two other buildings that survived, P.R. Hoffman, that's to close any day, I guess. They're or Hoffman Materials, the old P.R. Hoffman building on Cherry Street. Mm-hmm. They're in the process of transferring that production to North Carolina, and then that'll be torn down and made into apartments. And the old Hunt property, which became Murata Erie, and then the business incubator, is now occupied by Hoffman Machine that makes the lat machines that were used. So we have a little bits that survives, but it's ironic that P. Reynolds Hoffman is the guy that really locally left the legacy.
Well, I imagine that the business incubator will be around for forever.
Yeah, I don't think that they're in that building. That they actually sold that building, and it's owned by a private individual.
Really?
And then leased the Hoffman Machine.
I wonder how they did that, because it was always understood that the way Murata wanted to get rid of that building, but the land was contaminated because of people dumping stuff out the back door at midnight. And the only way they could get rid of it was to give it away.
Right.
And of course, at the time, it was such a nice gesture, and everybody was patting each other on the back, but they gave it away to get rid of it. And so I wonder how they were able to sell it.
Well, they probably mitigated it.
Well, that could have been, yeah.
No, part of the deal with the Reeves-Hoffman building was about $1 million, at least $1 million in mitigation, if not $3.5 million. It was a good bit to mitigate that property as well.
Well, when we sold to Oak, one of the contingencies, of course, was that we get a clear survey of the property, and there was a name for it which escapes me. And so they came and took all kinds of soil samples, which were luckily very good. And we had a fuel oil tank buried that, of course, ran a furnace. And I remember standing there with Chuck Jensick when they were pulling that tank with big chains on it, and they lifted it up. It hadn't been used for years. And I remember Chuck saying, please be dry, please be dry. And it was just like a desert under, so we really lucked out in that regard. And I don't blame them for wanting to know what they were getting.
Right.
We were very militant about our hazardous disposal. Chuck actually made the guy who was responsible for that ride with the company that disposed of it down somewhere below Chambersburg, and it was put in a specific kind of landfill where in the drums, and it was lined and everything, and he made him go down and see it being put in there so that it didn't end up in a creek somewhere on the way down. Right. And he was pretty militant about that because he did not want any repercussions.
Which was a good investment, because that can even...
Well, there are a lot of rumors around about who poured stuff out the back door at midnight.
Yeah.
And even in ancillary industries that were companies that were semi-related to this one.
Yeah, I've seen some cases where people were arrested and pled guilty and fined $5,000, and that was 30 years ago, so it would be much more than that
Right.
now. And TCE, trichloroethylene, was...
It was a big cleaning agent of printed circuit boards, yes.
Right, and that's pretty nasty stuff, actually, the way it permeates. And
Well, but in the crystal industry too, there was a lot of acid used of various types and other etching materials and the waste of the grinding, because the oil, there was a suspension oil that was used, that of course ended up being quote unquote contaminated. I'm not sure it was hazardous, but it was still not something you wanted to put in the ground.
Interesting. Okay, Blair, any other recollections that you have? Really appreciate this.
No, I think it's really fun.
Cover a lot of ground.
Yeah, it's really fun. A real march back through time.